The air in that boardroom always smelled like lemon polish and someone else's confidence. Mahogany so dark it swallowed gestures, high-backed chairs arranged like a jury, and a single window that framed the city as if it were a prop. I had rehearsed the deck twice that morning, not because the slides were fragile, they weren't, but because the people across that table were practiced at seeing weakness where none existed. They called it a $2 billion strategic alliance. In truth, it was ego given an ROI, a family office haircut polished into a term sheet. Sterling Hart stood to gain control of a platform that had been stumbling through scaling, and my team had spent 18 months stitching together the approvals, the appendices, the Montana clause nobody else could reconcile. The Montana appendix, land rights, water covenants, legacy easements, was a legal tangle with a lineage. It wasn't glamorous. It was what keeps a deal sane when one person dies or a trust changes hands. It was the reason Marcus Sterling had agreed to extend exclusivity. It was the reason the term sheet included a key man contingency naming me, and why the board's counsel had insisted on a private contact in the NDA. I knew the chain of papers, the last handwritten note from the trust's attorney, and the shortcuts the firm's new chief of staff hadn't bothered to read. Cassidy had never wanted to learn those things. She wanted the title. She wanted the moment where everyone applauded because she looked the part. She had the pearl buttons, the bob cut, the newly minted acting chief of staff placard that gave her permission to pretend authority. She was pretty as a powdering of confidence and twice as brittle. She walked in like somebody who'd been handed a script. Her heels clicked. 1, 2, deliberate, calibrated to the acoustics of power. The room tilted. A few phones stilled. Cassidy carried the employee handbook in one hand and a smile in the other, like a prosecutor with a ribbon. "You're late," she said. The sentence hadn't even landed before she'd launched into it. The tone, the weaponization of policy. The handbook is explicit on appearance. No visible brand insignia. No oversized hems. This is professional conduct. We can't have representatives of Sterling Hart appearing unvetted. I remember the lemon polish sliding across the table as if the room itself were being buffed for scandal. Legal's face tightened. The general counsel always looked like he inhaled his decisions. Henderson, our CFO, adjusted his glasses, the way someone prepares to measure collateral damage. Cassidy's hand flicked the handbook onto the table. "Because of that," she said, and she read from a clause she'd found convenient. "I'm temporarily relieving you of liaison duties, effective immediately." The sarcasm in temporarily was meant to sting. A firing dressed as an administrative correction. For a second, the world narrowed to my pulse and to the sound of my own breath. I had prepared data, not for this kind of theater. I had prepared contingency language, not to be humiliated over a blazer. I could see the shortcut, the headline that would ripple through an internal memo, the whispered email to Marcus's assistant suggesting instability, the insinuation that the person they'd built the Montana appendix around was now non-compliant with dress code. The work we'd done for 2 years could be undermined by a viral HR incident packaged as professional standards. Cassidy stood, triumphant. She expected the flinch. She expected the apology, the grovel, the plea to be kept on in some lesser role. She expected people to look at me and see a liability. I did not make the mistake of giving her what she wanted. I smiled. It's a small thing, the way a smile can be surgical. It's an economy of movement. You don't have to be theatrical to be devastating. I stood, took my briefcase, and started to tidy the space around me. I folded a report, slipped a pen into my sleeve, and replaced the leather folio over the Montana appendix, under the tab where I kept the handwritten margin notes no one at the firm had a legal right to dust off. I closed the laptop. I gathered my coat. "Cassidy," I said, a simple, measured name used like punctuation. "Have a good afternoon." She blinked, confused by the lack of survival panic. The staff were watching. Sarah, my assistant, was in the doorway, her face taut, the kind of taut that moves into action and wants to break. Sarah's hands were clamped around the strap of her bag. I nodded at her. She exhaled the way a person does when told not to call the captain down from the bridge. There are 3 mistakes people make when they think they have your career in their hands. They either assume you'll beg, they assume you'll retaliate immediately, or they assume you don't know how to make their leverage your currency. Cassidy expected the first. She got none of those things. After the meeting, I walked out of that room with the same gait I'd walked in with. My heels made an ordinary sound against the floor. No statement, no hiss of triumph. The lobby smelled like stone and the muted rush of water from the waterfall feature. People think politics is loud. It's not. Most of the time, it's the polite world adding its decibels until someone's breath is drowned out. On the sidewalk, I protected my phone with a sleeve and let the firm's internal messages pile up in the notification bubble. I let them think they had already made me irrelevant. For their purposes, this was efficient. For mine, it was an offer. If you like stories about power moves, subscribe, there's more coming. But if you want to understand why that line matters, when someone publicly declares you a liability, they are asking you to become one. Sarah met me at the curb with a paper cup and a look that said there were 5 versions of the next step, and none of them were pretty.
She had the sort of loyalty that showed up in the small logistics, the quiet inventory, the charging cords, the emergency binder with client notes, a binder clip of personal contacts that had no place in the firm's CRM. She is useful in the way good aides are. She empties your inbox in a way that preserves what matters. "Do you want to call HR?" she asked. "No," I said. I slid the briefcase from my hand and opened it, not to rummage, but to confirm. The Montana appendix sat in the leather fold, as it had for months. The handwritten margin notes were tucked into a smaller envelope. Inside that, a list of discrete contact numbers, one of which had been labeled by someone else in a past memo as S. Sterling, private. It was my leverage. It was also, I knew, a liability if mishandled. "Turn off push notifications," I told Sarah, "and don't send anything to the firm inbox unless I say so." She hesitated, but she understood the hint. Containment, not concession. We were not going to create a paper trail that read like panic. We left the building, and I went somewhere nobody from the firm would expect, to a small gallery 3 blocks east, where the lighting was forgiving and the air was quiet. I do my planning in places that require you to look at something and know it's framed. It keeps the mind honest. I sat by a painting of a shoreline, cool blues, a suggestion of distance, and unpacked the narrative of the morning. The Montana appendix is not dramatic. It's a lattice of covenants, a history of who controls what when someone dies, divorces, or disappears. It's the kind of thing that sits in footnotes until someone needs it to hold the rest of the structure up. I knew it because I'd stitched together past survey notes with the family's estate memos. I had spent time on the phone with the trust attorney in Helena under a thin sun, and he had written with a kind of old man precision that made the margin notes readable only to those willing to parse intent from habit. That knowledge had a value the firm's new management underestimated. You can't replace institutional knowledge with policy memos. You can't replicate decades of human relationship with a CRM import. You can try to simulate trust with an org chart, but relationships are not table stakes you can gamble away. That evening, I sat with a glass of wine and the logic of leverage. The firm had removed me from the stage, thinking they had clipped the essential player. But removing a player from a narrative doesn't erase their fingerprints from the documents. It doesn't make the Montana appendix less tangled. It doesn't make Marcus Sterling like anyone else in the market. Marcus Sterling is a patriarch of a kind you read about in PACE studies. He reads slower than most of his peers. He speaks rarely. When he does, people notice. He keeps a private circle, small, loyal, intolerant of posturing. I'd earned one corner of that circle years ago when a negotiation threatened the trust continuity.
There are things we do while putting on suits that look like competence, but are actually relationships in the rough. Marcus had given me his private line in the NDA because he wanted discretion. He wanted someone who could untangle municipal easements at 3 a.m. and not ask for a medal. I called him that night. Not immediately. There was a strategy to pacing. You don't rush the person who controls the veto. You make the call when they have space to listen. The voicemail clicked off and a landline quiet before his assistant answered. I could hear him in the background, the muffled certainty of someone who decides when to enter a room. Then he took the line himself with the sound of pages shifting. "Emily," he said. "Marcus," I said. I told him what had happened, not in the tone of someone seeking validation, but in the tone of someone giving a report. Facts only, with the detail that would prove useful. Cassidy's claim, the dressing down in front of the board, the explicit timing. I told him plainly that the firm had relieved me of liaison duties and had not engaged the Montana appendix clauses as previously negotiated. There was silence on the other end of the line, a kind of listening that meant assessment. "They fired you over a blazer?" Marcus asked once. The question was blunt. The incredulity implied a measure of contempt for people who perform power without understanding the fabric that supports it. "Yes," I said. "They made a policy of my wardrobe the mechanism to dissolve my role." "It's exactly the sort of incompetence that weaponizes people's time," he said. "They've never understood that a handshake and a habit are more binding than paper. Did they contact my office?" "No." I had checked. No messages, no attempts to clarify. "They moved without alerting you." That was the detail that changed the chord. Marcus is not sentimental, but he is proprietorial about the mechanism of the deals he trusts. Does Henderson know? He asked. Henderson is at the board, I said, but the general counsel is piecing things together. They'll call legal. They'll prefer procedure over problem solving. How long? He asked. 48 hours, I said. That's the timeline where exclusivity lapses and counteroffers start looking attractive. The term sheet has a clause for immediate cessation of negotiations if either party deems the liaison compromised. It kicks in if your point of contact is sanctioned or removed. So they pulled you without checking, he said. The gravity in his tone was the weight of someone who understands consequences. Yes. There it was, the hinge. 36 hours of quiet panic, 12 hours of public collateral. The firm thought they had bought themselves a showy corrective. They hadn't considered the clock they'd set. Marcus made a sound like a small chuckle, not amused so much as satisfied by the way a chess player appreciates a blunder. Do you want to come and speak with me? I don't do theatrics, Emily, but I also don't negotiate with people who mistake image for stewardship. I listened. If a man like Marcus invites you to his office after a public humiliation, he has already counted the consequence as currency. He is the sort who will either remove an asset or acquire it, and he has both capital and patience. I don't want the firm's apology, I said. I want the deal to be held to the terms we agreed. You're not the kind of person who wants apologies, he said. Fair. Come tomorrow. Bring the folder you keep. I want to see what they think you took when you walked out. He said it without rancor, just arithmetic. His assistant, James, would meet me in the lobby at 9. James's role, for the record, was more than valet. He was a signalman, someone who kept the cadence of Marcus's life in order and could be trusted to coordinate an appearance that would be noticed without being sensational. After hanging up, I felt the methodical tightening people mistake for triumph. It wasn't triumph. It was reconnaissance. I had been relieved of duties by a woman whose understanding of the deal could be written on the inside of a bracelet. I was, in fact, precisely the person the counterparty had identified as critical. I had the Montana Appendix margin notes in my possession, and I had Marcus's private displeasure enough to make him willing to walk away from kitchen table politics. That night, I did what I always do before the next move. I stripped my life of digital clutter and kept only what mattered. I left breadcrumbs for no one, but I did not burn the bridges I might walk back across. There is a legal and an ethical cleanliness to the way I operate. I turned off push notifications on the work email, even that, a small strategic act that denies the firm the appearance of a continuing line. I called Sarah and asked her to patch me through only on a predetermined channel. She asked few questions. She knows the value of being unreadable. People talk about revenge as if it's a tidal sweep. They think there will be fireworks, a public spectacle. The version of vengeance I know is arithmetic. You convert what they took into leverage they would rather avoid having to price. You remind them that their balance sheet depends on competence they thought was dispensable. You do this without stepping into the theater they designed. You make them choose between truth and the collapse of value they believe is secure. My phone vibrated once, twice that evening. Messages from colleagues with a kind of nervous protocol. HR is drafting a memo, one said. We're going to need your replacement notes, another wrote, with that bureaucratic hunger that always follows a spectacle. I did not reply. By morning, the firm had started the litany of measured responses, panel reviews, internal investigations, offers of mediation. They circulated draft emails that read like calm after a storm, but no one had yet written a message to Marcus.
That was the omission that had the potential to unravel the entire term sheet. James was waiting in the Sterling lobby, tall, efficient, the kind of man who looks like he has memorized flight manifests for a living. He lifted an eyebrow when he saw me and offered a small, professional greeting. Marcus arrived 10 minutes later, like a man who has never been hurried. He wore the same winter coat he'd had for a decade, not flashy, not understated, simply consistent. He paused by the waterfall as if the sound steadied him. He did not make a spectacle of noticing the stairs. Emily, he said, and the name landed with possession. I rep a note. I'd like to understand. We went into a room with low light and a table that allowed for leaning. He looked at the Montana Appendix as if reading the fingerprint of an estate. He did not ask me to prove my competence. He assumed it because the paper bore the marks of attention no one else had spared. You didn't want them, he said at one point, meaning the firm's defensive firing. You want the deal to survive. I want the deal to survive as written, I said. I want the obligations we agreed to honored. The Montana Appendix is not something you can recreate overnight with an extern. It's a history. You don't believe in their ability to rectify, Marcus observed. I believe in the facts, I said. And right now, the fact is that they have created a procedural excuse to sideline me without addressing the appendices that bind this transaction. If they move forward without me, they will create a vulnerability. Someone will fill the hole because it's worth $2 billion to them. He listened and then tilted his head. We could play it different, Marcus offered. We could go quiet, proceed with someone else and make a smaller concession. Or we could make them choose their face-saving narratives versus a collapse of value that will haunt them. The phrase he used, make them choose, did not mean humiliate. It meant a calculated repositioning of incentives. He is a man who makes shareholders nervous because he will either buy or remove what is inefficient. He is not theatrical. He is decisive. How public do you want this? He asked. Public enough to stop them from moving forward without addressing the Montana Clause, I said, but not so public that it destroys the entire asset. I want the option to keep the company whole or to prevent them from consolidating in the wrong hands. He looked at me the way a man looks at a calculator, not for arithmetic, but for the idea of arithmetic. Show up opposite the signing, he said slowly. Not on our side of the table. Make yourself visible. Let the world see that the person they called a liability is not only present, but that you have standing with us. It was a theater of truth. He was not asking me to stage a controversy. He was asking me to be the fact, the human presence that cannot be footnoted out of a contract. He was asking me to be the signal.
And if they refuse to engage? I asked. Then we can decide what to buy and what to leave, he said, which is to say, if they insist on a public divorce between competence and image, one of us will write the purchase order. That night the plan took shape, without the violent edges of revenge. There would be no illegalities, no hacking into servers, no burning of documents. There would be presence, patience, the use of a personal relationship, and the legacy clause Marcus respected. There would be a public choice point, the signing in the Sterling Hart lobby, and the firm would have to reckon with the optics. We had 48 hours before the exclusivity window started to fray. The firm could panic and open the door to a rival. The trust could lose the leverage that Marcus and I had negotiated, and headlines could reduce 2 years of work to a spectacle. That is the arithmetic I wanted them to face. Not humiliation for its own sake, but a difficult choice that would expose their calculus. I told Sarah to prepare what I would need. Nothing sensational, only the elements that made me credible. The handwritten margin notes, a clean copy of the Montana Appendix, and the leather folio that looked like any liaison's briefcase. I dressed without drama, neutral cut, no logo, the pearl buttons replaced with a plain cuff. Image had been weaponized once. I refused to be bait for it. We staged small rehearsals, a coffee shop across from the Sterling Hart building, where James would signal with a plain napkin fold. Sarah would position herself 2 blocks away as fallback, and we discussed contingencies with the restraint of people who understand the legal peril of improvisation. Marcus's office would provide the legitimacy of the client. James would provide the coordination. My presence would provide the fact. There were small practical risks. Bonds would flinch, analysts would query the integrity of the transaction, and the firm's counsel could argue breach. But these were legal instruments, not explosives. The leverage I carried was contractual and relational, and it is far more durable than any social media flame. You can't litigate away the fact that someone held a relationship with the trust. You can't redact who sat at the negotiating table. Those are the reasons the Montana Appendix mattered, not because it was arcane, but because it had roots. I slept with the folder under my pillow like a map. It is a ridiculous thing to admit, but when a document holds people's futures, it ceases to be paper and starts to be a lodestar. Sarah called me at dawn with a list, flights to monitor, media triggers to track, and a note that the firm had begun internal memos. Henderson called her at 9 and asked if I would meet with him. They wanted to de-escalate. I let them try to de-escalate themselves. They were already late to the calculus. They had created an error and failed to understand the cost of it.
By mid-morning, I was across the street from Sterling Hart with nothing about me that read like protest. A black coat, a leather folio, the water feature murmuring in the lobby like a soundtrack for tension. People glance at the lobby like it's a stage, because sometimes it is. But I didn't want them to mistake my calm for passivity. Calm is a tool. It allows you to see who moves first. James waved from the reception. He gave me a small, curt nod. Marcus's assistant wore the kind of neutrality that reads as competence. He would take care of the timing. Sarah sent an encrypted text with the final cadence. Signal at 0942. No engagement unless necessary. I stood reading the room like a book. Cassidy had called a press contact earlier that morning, hoping to preempt the narrative. She wanted the firm to look decisive, and me to look unstable. The firm had already prepared a statement praising its commitment to professional standards. Their narrative was tidy. It was wrong. At 0940, a crowd began to gather. A handful of curious employees, a reporter fielding a call, a bank exec passing through. Their presence was accidental, and yet perfect. If the firm wanted to proceed quietly, they could. If they wanted the optics to be their armor, they would step into the trap of visibility. I straightened the cuff of my coat. The pearl buttons I once owned glinted in a memory, but were not present. I clicked my heels once inside, a small ritual of alignment. The waterfall's hum was steady, the air cool and metallic, the same motifs that had accompanied the beginning of the story. My hand brushed the leather folio. The Montana appendix was inside. The timeline was ticking. Outside, the city continued unaware of the arithmetic about to be applied to a $2 billion term sheet. Inside my chest, there was a measured beat, anticipation leaning toward inevitability. The choice being offered to the firm was simple in its cruelty. Choose truth and prosecute the deal with the facts, or choose theater and risk value. Someone had once told me that corporate revenge is a poor term for what we were doing. It's enforcement, they'd said. Enforcement of competence. Maybe they were right. Maybe the markets would call it a temper tantrum. Maybe the lawyers would call it messy. But I had been fired over the cut of my jacket, and if that was the currency they were using to rewrite commitments, then I would make the currency cost them. James signaled with a folded napkin. 10 short, precise movements that meant now. Sarah texted only an image. A chair in the coffee shop opposite with a coffee cup on it. Marcus's silhouette moved toward the lobby steps like a man deciding where to plant a flag. I closed my eyes for a fraction and let the water's hum fill me. The moment was not about spectacle. It was about accounting. A $2 billion deal is not sustained by rhetoric.
It is sustained by coalitions of trust, by easements that run across county lines, by people who keep their word in the small hours. If a company decides to erase the person who kept those things, they deserve to have to explain it to the market. My phone chimed with a single message from an unknown number, an automated alert from the firm's legal department that they were aware of unauthorized presence in the lobby. Someone in their office was already using their internal processes to weaponize me. I folded my hand around the leather folio as if it were a talisman and let the hum of the waterfall cover the rest. I stepped into the lobby. The door closed behind me like a punctuation mark. The air smelled like lemon polish and the metallic tang of other people's decisions. The people in the room took the measure of me. Cassidy, who had expected a trembling apology, watched me with an expression that moved from triumph to something like recalculation. This was the point where they would have to decide what they valued more, their corrected image or the fact that someone had spent 2 years making their deal coherent. The clock kept moving. 48 hours did not care for pride. It only cared for contingencies, and I had in my hand what they had chosen to mistake for a liability. The door closed behind me like a punctuation mark. The air smelled like lemon polish and the metallic tang of other people's decisions. The people in the room took the measure of me. Cassidy, who had expected a trembling apology, watched me with an expression that moved from triumph to something like recalculation. She stood with the handbook still in her hand, a prop suddenly too small for the scene. Her pearl buttons caught the overhead light and threw it back like an accusation. Henderson's jaw tightened. The general counsel, who had the look of someone rehearsed in Fence's bolt of legalese, cleared his throat as if to restore order. The lobby hummed, the waterfall, the murmur of conversation, the small chorus of phones lifting to see what the commotion was. Marcus did not hurry. He moved through the room as if measuring his steps against the architecture of the moment. He paused a few feet from Cassidy and tilted his head, the way someone might examine a painting closer for a forgery. The silence his presence made was not theatrical. It was the kind of quiet that holds a verdict. "You made a policy decision to remove your point of contact without consulting my office," he said. His voice was low and even. It carried across the lobby like a ledger entry that would be noted. Cassidy's mouth opened. She had a script,
accuse, justify, control the phrasing, but it unspooled where it met someone for whom consequences were not rhetorical. "Mr. Sterling," she began, the formality of her title hanging like armor, "we acted within our HR policies. Liaison conduct is part of our governance. The firm—" "You relieved her over a blazer," Marcus said. The incredulity in that sentence did more work than any invective. People in the room shifted in their chairs. Employees peered from behind pillars. The lobby was suddenly small and honest. Henderson tried to intercede. "We made a judgment call to protect professional standards," he said. "This is about preserving the integrity of the platform in front of ownership." "Who signed the Montana Appendix?" Marcus asked, sharp now, like the page turn of someone with a reason to be direct. Henderson's face moved through a sequence: calculation, evasion, then the thin white of panic. "We did," he said. Our counsel prepared it alongside legal." Marcus looked at the leather folio in my hand the way someone looks at an instrument that should be placed in competent hands. "Emily has been the liaison since inception," he said. "Her name is in the key man clause. The exclusivity we offered was predicated on her stewardship." Cassidy's color drained just a little. That was not the effect she'd banked on. She had expected applause, or at least an embarrassed quiet. Instead, she'd created a question that could not be answered by policy alone. "You removed the person with the institutional relationship that underwrites the trust," Marcus continued. "You did it because of appearances. You will understand why I find that unacceptable. There are people who make choices in public and think the gesture is the point. The firm had performed governance. They had not thought to perform competence. The difference was what was now unspooling in front of them." Marcus turned away from Cassidy and addressed the room, not just the board. "We will pause negotiations," he said, and the words fell like a shudder. "Sterling Hart will not sign with a firm that chooses image over stewardship. This is the moment reporters live for. It is the fraction of time when a balance sheet tilts and the market notices." Phones appeared from pockets, wrists flicked toward screens. Someone murmured, "Is he walking?" and the whisper moved through the room like a wind across thin paper. "He did not sign. He did not ask for an apology. He turned, offered me a small, precise nod as if the nod were a contract, and left." James followed, discreet. The lobby exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for years. The silence that followed his departure was not empty. It was full of 1,000 small decisions. Cassidy tried to reclaim the narrative. "We can proceed with another liaison," she said, louder now, anxious to demonstrate control. "We have contingency staffing. This is overstated." "That contingency isn't worth what it pretends to be," a voice said from the back. It was Sarah, my assistant, who had slipped into the room without fanfare. She stood with the composed defiance of someone who keeps the right envelopes in the right pocket. "You remove the one line the trust counts on. You can appoint another person. You can't replant the history." The general counsel moved to speak, but his sentences lost their shape under the pressure of the lobby's new geometry. Analysts on phone calls were recalculating. The firm's PR contact appeared at the edge of the crowd with a printed statement like armor, but statements are thin. They exist until someone with cash chooses to make them irrelevant. By noon, the press narrative had begun to congeal. The firm's internal memo about upholding professional standards threaded through headlines. Analysts noted a pause in talks. The term sheet that had looked stable in committee suddenly looked conditional in the market. Stock tickers hiccuped in a way that is not catastrophic but is expensive, a recognized vulnerability that invites predators. Inside the building, interviews were held in corridors, escalations routed to legal, and the board convened an emergency session. I watched the choreography, Henderson pacing like a man trying to outrun arithmetic, the general counsel consulting notes, the VP's father, who had once taught control as a family discipline, burning with an embarrassment that had been purchased by his daughter's ambition. Cassidy retreated into a defensive script that misread everything she saw as salvageable. She delivered a memo that called for an immediate reconciliation with key stakeholders. It read like a diplomatic cable written by someone who had never negotiated with a patriarch who keeps not only capital but patience. The 48-hour clock became audible. Where it had been a concept in papers and footnotes, it now had faces. Competitors who'd been watching for a sign of weakness smelled opportunity. A rival family office made a discreet inquiry through counsel, the kind that reads as casual but is in fact a reconnaissance suite for value. When the board finally convened in the mahogany room where the morning had begun, the atmosphere was different. The lemon polish seemed less effective against a new kind of tarnish, the possibility that the firm's performance metrics were now infected by miscalculation. The board's fiduciary obligations are not abstract, they are the reason meetings get ugly. If a partner can walk without the firm's consent because the firm has made a governance misstep, then shareholders' risk models change on a dime. Henderson argued mitigation, offer Marcus concessions, appoint a senior partner to work in parallel. But Marcus's move had been strategic. He had not merely pulled the plug, he had exposed that the firm had allowed a non-expert in place of an institutional steward, and expected no consequence. The board's calculations pivoted from defense to triage. Do we salvage a deal that is now contingent and mark the company down, or do we cut our losses and preserve capital? In the end, the language was procedural: authorizations, emergency votes, council's memos, but the result was arithmetic. The exclusivity window closed without renewal.
A competing consortium, sensing the opening, lodged a preliminary expression of interest. Rumors hardened into offers, offers hardened into formal letters. In public, the firm promised continuity. In private, it brokered damage containment. What follows is rarely cinematic. It is spreadsheets and sober faces. Sterling Hart's withdrawal stopped the signature. It did not immediately yield the assets to anyone. But markets are not patient with uncertainty. Credit lines tightened. Underwriters took unfavorable views. Debt covenants came under new scrutiny. Suddenly, the $2 billion number that had been presented as a tidy valuation took on hairline fractures. It is important to be honest about what happened next. The firm did not implode in a single dramatic moment because a head popped too soon. It imploded in a dozen small decisions that added up. Boards are conservative because they must be, but when conservatism collides with misjudgment, conservatism becomes evacuation. 2 days after the lobby scene, Marcus called a meeting, not of threats but of options. He had watched how the firm had handled a simple human judgment and had calculated the cost of incompetence. "There's value here," he said plainly, "but there's also risk, and risk becomes cost." He presented a proposal that was blunt in its arithmetic. Sterling Hart would offer to acquire key assets, non-core subsidiaries, IP, the platform's client roster, at a price that reflected the new risk profile. 30 cents on the dollar, he said. He presented it as dispassionately as a balance sheet. The offer was legally and commercially sound. It was not malice. It was a market response to mispricing. Board members cringed. Some called it opportunistic. Others, those with fiduciary duty in their profile, saw an exit at a price that, while steep, preserved capital and placated lenders. The firm's counsel worked the clauses. The offer was framed as a negotiated purchase, contingent on due diligence and board approval, not as a hostile takeover. Still, the optics were brutal, an institutional price decline that bore Cassidy's fingerprints. I sat across the table and watched faces I had worked alongside for years. There was a distance in their gaze where once had been the ease of colleagueship. Now their looks were weighted by the calculus of solvency. Henderson argued for a counteroffer. The VP's father argued for the long view, salvage the platform's independence at all costs. For a moment, the debate was less about ethics and more about whether stubbornness was an asset or a liability. "You can't buy back trust," Marcus said quietly. "You can buy assets, you can assume liabilities. You can't buy the days someone spent keeping the lines clear." The board voted. It is a strange corporate form of grief, the formal decision to trade what you had hoped for in exchange for what you can keep. The vote split, but in the end, the vote was pragmatic.
The firm accepted an offer to sell a material portion of the platform at the price Marcus proposed, rather than risk a protracted courtroom fight, a plummet in stock price, and a drawn-out loss of creditor confidence. The calculation was not heroic. It was arithmetic. 30 cents on the dollar is not a figure you celebrate. It is a figure you accept when other options are worse. Cassidy sat through the meeting and watched the market treat her correction as a mispricing of competence. She had wanted the placard of authority. She did not want the accountability that comes with it. The VP's father, whose own reputation had always been wrapped in the idea of steady hands, made a decision that looked less like paternal protection and more like damage control. He called Cassidy into his office afterward with a silence that was louder than any rebuke. For them, the private reckoning would be slow. For the firm, the public accounting was immediate. Marcus's acquisition did not erase the platform, it reshaped it. Employees were reassigned, contracts were renegotiated. Some people stayed, bound by non-compete clauses and the inertia of life. Others left. Sterling Hart integrated the assets into a holding structure and made me an offer that was an index of trust and of intent, direction of strategic acquisitions across the family's holdings, with the authority to rebuild stewardship across better terms. There is a texture to offers like that. They are both opportunity and absolution. They mean you get to do the work you respect without asking permission of people who misread value. They mean you are carried forward by someone who understands the parts of the trade that are invisible to newcomers. I did not take the offer immediately. There was a negotiation, not of spite, but of boundaries. I wanted autonomy. I wanted the right to protect the Montana appendix and to ensure that stewardship could not be shrugged off as theater. Marcus acquiesced where it mattered. He wrote terms that acknowledged the role of institutional knowledge as a scarce and non-transferable asset. He insisted on a clause that made stewardship visible and not easily displaced. It was, in its own way, a contract against future theatrical firings. When the handshake happened, it was not a revenge scene. It was the closing of a chapter and the opening of another. There is a satisfaction in that, not the gloating kind, but the kind that comes from resetting the moral balance of a transaction.
The firm had tried to reduce stewardship to a dress code. The market had reminded them that stewardship is not performative. There were consequences for Cassidy. She retained titles but lost influence. When someone ties your brand to hubris, easing back into power looks like a manual in humility. The VP's father, whose own reputation had always been wrapped in the idea of steady hands, installed an external oversight committee and argued for a complete review of governance.
There were public statements, calibrated, cautious, and a flurry of internal notes promising lessons learned. None of that restored the 2 years of careful stewardship that had made the Montana Appendix legible. People like to imagine revenge as a moment. That misunderstands institutional time. Revenge at scale is accounting. You translate the cost of someone's miscalculation into something the market can understand. You do not humiliate so much as you make mispricing expensive. I do not pretend no one suffered. Employees lost jobs, careers realigned. That is the gravity of leverage. It changes who sits where and how they make bread. But there was also restoration. The Montana Appendix, the document that had been treated as a dusty footnote, now had the protection of someone who understood what it meant in practice. The trust continued under stewardship that honored legacy rather than image. My ascension into the role with Marcus's holding company was less an act of triumph and more of invitation. I was offered resources, yes, but more importantly, discretion. I was given the ability to reframe deals on terms that recognize the value of relationships, of margin notes, of phone calls made at 3 a.m. because the people involved knew the stakes. Sarah moved with me, not because she wanted to leave the firm, but because she is loyal to competence. James stayed at Marcus's office as part of the inner cadence. Henderson remained at the firm, but with a different posture. He had learned that caution without curiosity is thin protection. I did not go looking for a public reckoning against Cassidy. The market did that work. People remember actions differently when dollars are attached to them. That is the merciless logic of corporate life. Still, there were moments, a chance encounter in a hallway, a board member's averted eye, where the cost of a small cruelty was visible. That is more than enough. The final scene was not an epilogue so much as a re-roll. I walked out of the boardroom one last time as a different kind of liaison, not for one firm, but for a cluster of holdings that recognize the value of the small, stubborn things that hold a deal together. My briefcase was the same leather, but there was a different weight to what it carried. Not vengeance, exactly. Accountability. I think about the Montana Appendix often, not because of its legal clauses, but because of what it taught me about how organizations value what they cannot easily measure. It taught me that the person who knows the footnotes is rarely the one with the loudest voice. It taught me that when someone tries to rewrite your worth by wielding policy like a sword, the right response is not to scream, but to do the bookkeeping that matters. People ask if I regretted the path we took. I do not. Regret is a luxury for those not in the business of stewardship. What I feel is a steady awareness. The next time someone mistakes spectacle for substance, I will be ready.
Not because I enjoy the math, but because I know what it costs when institutions treat stewardship like ornamentation. Cassidy kept her pearl buttons. They were slightly duller by the time the dust settled. People still complimented her on them. That is the kind of pity that is almost tender, a recognition that sometimes power gives you the costume before it gives you the craft. The market digests stories quickly. 2 years later, Sterling Hart's acquisition came to be viewed in retrospectives as decisive. Some called it opportunistic. Some called it prudent. I prefer to think of it as corrective. It was a reallocation of responsibility from those who perform competence to those who practice it. When asked what I learned, I answer simply, keep your margin notes, keep your contacts, respect the small hours where deals are decided. Teach your team to value the ledger that is not only numbers, but people. I walked away from the platform not as someone who had been ruined, but as someone who had been reckoned with the truth. She tried to ruin my career, the headline reads in some versions of the story. She lost a $2 billion deal, says the subhead. Both are true in the arithmetic of motives and outcomes, but the shape of the story is not personal vindictiveness, it is institutional correction. The firm chose posture over person. The market corrected the misprice. I found a place where stewardship mattered more than staging. There is a quiet pleasure in being underestimated. It bends the world toward you when discipline meets opportunity. I did not set out to punish Cassidy. I set out to ensure that what had been built would not be reduced to a talking point. The result was consequence, not spectacle. And in corporate life, consequence is the most effective pedagogy. I still pass Sterling Hart now and then. The lobby smells the same.
lemon polish, water, the faint metallic note of other people's decisions. Sometimes I think about the way Cassidy's heels clicked that morning, the sound of someone unsure of the instrument they had been given. I do not wish anyone ill. I wish only that institutions remember the difference between image and stewardship before they mistake one for the other. If this story resonated, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated at work? Who noticed your margin notes?